It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome Professor Eben Kirksey to our virtual platform. Eben, thank you so much for being here. It really is a great honor for myself, for the VIAD Research Center, for the University of Johannesburg, to have someone of your stature and someone of your research capacity, someone of your range of interests, to take some time out of your very busy schedule, I'm sure, to present this talk. So thank you again and welcome. Thank you also to our guests who responded with such alacrity to our invitation to attend Eben's talk. And the title of his talk is Decentered Multi-Species Design. I'll just introduce myself very briefly. My name is Brenton Mart, and I'm the curator of the Bio, Art and Design Africa Research Program that we initiated at the VIAD Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. And BARDA, as we call the strand, is dedicated to research into how the biological arts might be used as a form of decolonial activism within a continent that continues to bear the brunt of insidious abuses. To do this, we curate exhibitions, we publish catalogs, we edit and publish special editions of journals, we host colloquia, seminars, other forms of scholarly engagement. We've initiated an incredible international program of artists in residence, and also we host more popular forms of public engagement within the live sphere and also within the virtual sphere. Now, in terms of Eben, Professor Eben Kirksey has recently joined our team as a senior research associate. And this talk is the first of what I hope is an ongoing, fruitful and productive exchange between Eben and the BARDA team. So Eben, again, really is a great honor to have you with us here today. That is the end of my very brief introduction, and now I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Keisha Jacobs, who will facilitate the proceedings henceforth. So Keisha, thank you, over to you.
Thank you, Brenton. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for your virtual attendance. I am Keisha Jacobs, your facilitator for this webinar with Eben Kirksey, Professor of Anthropology at the University of Oxford. Professor Eben Kirksey is the author of 3 books, namely The Mutant Project, Inside the Global Race to Genetically Modify Humans, published in 2020, Emergent Ecologies, published in 2015, and Freedom in Entangled Worlds, West Papua and the Architecture of Global Power, published in 2012. Eben is also the co-editor of The Promise of Multispecies Justice, published in 2022, and the editor of the Multispecies Salon, published in 2014. There are a multitude of research interests reflected in his publications, such as medical anthropology, biological art, disability, medical ethics, CRISPR gene editing, continental philosophy, human rights, reproductive rights, the environment, and novel ecosystems. Eben's current research interests concern the human condition and how it has been shaped by symbiotic viruses, biotechnology, chemical exposures, and capitalism. Throughout his engagement with these thematics, there is a recurring theme of hope, which he describes as not as naive optimism, but as a method for identifying fragile possibilities for life, justice, and peaceful coexistence. Given his outstanding academic background, Eben is the recipient of numerous prestigious scholarships, fellowships, awards, and grants, including the Australian Research Council Discovery Grant and the Diana Forsyth Book Prize, awarded for emergent ecologies in recognition for his contribution to feminist science studies. This evening, Eben will be speaking about his work on decentered multi-species design, which draws from his presentation at an international symposium in 2024, titled More Than Human Design After the Anthropocene. To provide context, I will quote Eben himself, who explains that human-centered design research is extending beyond the user-technology interface to engage with issues related to social change and social justice. Now that multi-species justice concerns are transforming the political landscape, it is time to decenter design work, to push past the domain of the human. Before I hand over to Eben, please note that at the end of his presentation, we will be accepting questions from the audience. These could be posed live, or please feel free to pop your questions in the Q&A tab on your Zoom screen. It is now my honor to welcome Professor Eben Kirksey. Eben, over to you.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, Keisha and Brenton. It's a real delight to be with you here virtually in Johannesburg. Greetings from Oxford. And I also want to acknowledge some people who might be here online with us today. So many of my ideas related to decentered multi-species design have emerged in conversation with other folks. This includes Michael Beach, who is a doctoral student who's about to finish up at the University of Washington. And yeah, these ideas have evolved over many years in conversation. I also want to give a shout out to my partner, Asha Mileska, and also David O'Leary, who today we're literally digging in the dirt right outside of the window where I'm presenting from today. So at the same time that I've been thinking about these ideas in virtual worlds, multi-species design was happening today in my backyard, and I got to witness it. So empathy is really kind of the key word for thinking about human-centered design, and we have a lot of resources for thinking about this. I think one of the central reference points is Donna Haraway's Manifesto for Cyborgs that gave us an idea of how to think with and against capitalist assemblages, technological assemblages, to think about what it means to be human and post-human within these networks. An early performance art, something that kind of fused performance art and design work was done by Pat Moore, who at the age of 26 dressed up like she was 85 years old. So she was working in this Midtown Manhattan design firm. Basically, everybody around her was talking about design for normative bodies, but she became really curious about what it would be like to design things, a refrigerator, common house tools for someone with arthritis. So in addition to kind of inviting people with arthritis to interact with various parts of the built environment, she herself dressed up again as if she was 85 years old. And this has been featured in the recent Handbook of Revolution for Empathy by Roman Kazanarek, one of my friends here in Oxford. But I think I wanted to start with this as a way of decentering the normative human and getting past ageist and ableist imaginaries in the design world. There's a lot of design failures, and in some ways, seeing injustice in design is easier than seeing design justice. So just to point out one that had life and death consequences for many people during the pandemic, the pulse oximeter that was used to tell doctors if a particular patient was about to die from COVID is basically designed with white bodies in mind. So we might rethink design with social justice in mind. Social justice is about equity, access, well-being, participation, and rights of the people involved. It's about empathizing with folks who might have a body that doesn't conform to whatever standardized ideas of the normal pervade in science and medicine. Also, racial justice is an important thing to think about in relation to design. How do we reckon with the historical and colonial roots of racial violence, and how is this violence embedded in the very technologies and built environments that structure our world? So those two species of justice that I just mentioned are from the glossary that I co-wrote with Sophie Chow, a former student of mine, who helped me edit this special issue, special book, The Promise of Multi-Species Justice. And I'll be returning to a lot of those ideas from this glossary today. I also want to offer another way of thinking about empathy in multi-species worlds, not drawing on that book, but drawing on the work of Laurie Gruen, who talks about entangled empathy. So trying to think about empathy that works beyond the human. Laurie Gruen has done work with primates and chimpanzees in particular, to think about the possibilities of empathy in interspecies encounters, where beings that share worlds together can recognize one another as empathic beings and have a motivation to fulfill the needs of others and also attune themselves to the interests of others. One of the critters that I've tried to empathize with is my favorite ant, pictured here, Ectotoma ruidum. So if Laurie Gruen is working with primates that have faces that are very much like ours, In my second book, I was very interested in what it might be like to empathize with an insect that has a face very different to ours, that has antenna as the main ways that it grapples with worlds and understands others. In this book about the promise of multi-species justice, we also explore the possibility of empathizing with others that don't have a face. What does it mean to empathize with a slime mold? Asks Karen Bolander, who took the lead on writing the afterword to this collection. She's asking us to empathize with forms of life that are embodied doing material semiotic action in a way that doesn't necessarily engage with logos, with language. So how do we think about justice that is beyond language, justice that isn't logocentric or phallogocentric, as Derrida would have it, but how do we think about a justice that grows, that is maybe a fugitive kind of justice, that escapes the ability of human institutions to name even, much less kind of advocate for in juridical and legal realms. So the key questions of this book that I co-authored with Sophie and Karen Bolander are: what are the possibilities of multi-species justice? How does social justice struggles intersect with the lives of animals, plants, and other creatures? And this book is a project of thinking in a collective, thinking with a multitude of friends. So in addition to Sophie Chow and Karen Bolander, you see many of my co-conspirators in this project, among others, Kim Tallbear, Josh Ihar, Jacques Lee, Michael Marder. Together, we were all trying to think about the possibilities of justice. So today's talk is coming out of this collective conversation, thinking about how we might bring these principles and questions to design worlds. So thinking back to that glossary I already told you about, two of the other keywords I want to introduce today are transformative justice and generative justice. So transformative justice is maybe in opposition to a carceral form of justice. So if someone does wrong in the carceral system, they're locked up, they're put in jail. But a transformative approach to justice asks how perpetrators of injustice might transform themselves in order to repair what they have damaged. Ron Eglash coined the term generative justice to think about bottom-up projects that are collective resistance to hegemonic structures of power. These might involve peer-to-peer networks, queer groups, indigenous federations, as well as loops of nested multi-species generation and ecological communities. So I'm going to basically insist that we're all living with injustice in the contemporary world, and that we're not innocent, that the transformative justice project is as much about taking inventory about the injustices that we're living with and that the assemblages that we're embedded within perpetuate, and also imagine new worlds that might get beyond the current systems that we abhor. So in thinking about the enormity of justice, I find this artwork by Anna Sophie Springer and Etienne Turpin very helpful. So it started in Indonesia. They did a project where they basically just tried to collect not biological specimens, but specimens from the industrial design system. These are all commodities. These are all things that are marketed to us in shiny containers with all kinds of promises about nutrition and health benefits. But what they all are is basically from palm oil plantations. This is a palm oil plantation that has just clear cut the forest in West Papua. So if you look closely at this picture, your eyes might be better than mine. I've studied it before, so I know that basically what you have is a certain kind of blue ribbon butter on here. You have Hostess Twinkies, a favorite snack, and for a certain kind of school child in the United States. You have aloe vera gel, you have shaving cream, you have shampoo. So I bet probably in this Zoom room, most of us have touched palm oil in some way today, whether that's the deodorant you used, or the hair products that you used, or the cookies or biscuits that you ate for a snack just before joining us. So again, I want to think about us all in this position of non-innocence, again, to think back about the possibilities of transformative justice, since we all live in a world that in some ways we abhor. So Sophie Chow, again, my co-editor on the Multispecies Justice Project, has written an excellent book called In the Shadow of the Palms about palm oil plantations in West Papua, a place where I've been working since 1998. And I want to think in relation to this artwork and the ecological unworlding, the apocalyptic nightmares that are proliferating in places like West Papua, in conversation with the Udaido Collective. This is a collection of Papuan artists, indigenous intellectuals, who are trying to think about social justice. So this piece is called Papuan Lives Matter. It's trying to interpolate themselves into the global assemblages of justice that emerged after, in a big way, during the pandemic, after African American men in particular were being choked to death by US police officers. Papuans are trying to insist that their lives matter too. This is a project of social justice, a project of sovereignty. They want freedom in a world that is stacked against them, where extractive industries have created a geopolitical situation that is very difficult to escape. But they also want racial justice. So if you look at this artwork carefully, what you'll see is representatives of the Indonesian state standing on books that say democracy and humanity, basically denying fully human status to Papuans, insisting that they alone can kind of speak for the project of modernity, and that certain modes of being indigenous need to be eradicated and eliminated. There's a slow motion genocide that's happening in West Papua. Upwards of 150,000 people have been killed since Indonesia invaded in 1961. I mentioned, how Indonesians are denying fully human status to the Papuan peoples. In many ways, this is a problem of recognition justice. Being recognized as fully human before the law is something that many people around the world are struggling with these days. If you're killed in West Papua, if you're an indigenous Black man or woman, you might not get legal standing. You might not enjoy the same sorts of rights that have been promised to humanity under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So in many ways, this project of multi-species justice is critical of human rights. It's saying these kinds of rights projects have failed in human worlds. So if we're thinking in a purely rights idiom, that might also fail if we think about rights in more than human worlds. Again, thinking back with transformative justice, this is an image of a woman who has been killed in West Papua. The band-aid across her head has an acronym on it. It's Dera Operasi Militer, or DOM. This is a piece that's basically thinking with death and thinking about the productive possibilities that might grow out of a genocide like this. So again, thinking back to this piece that gives us a personal connection to this ongoing genocide, to this ecocide that's happening in West Papua and many other parts of the world, I want you all to be thinking about transformative justice. This is a topic that's very timely. This week, COP is happening in Brazil, and this new project has been launched. It's a $125 billion project to basically pay governments and pay indigenous peoples to protect forests. The idea is that if they pay to keep the forest standing, there's going to be less incentives for these kinds of clear cuts, less incentives to transform the forest into this kind of, diverse kinds of commodities that we're all enjoying on a regular basis. In some ways, this project, Tropical Forest Forever facility, launched by Brazil, Indonesia is a key investor, Norway has just pledged some money to it. In many ways, it embodies the contradictions of capital. So at the same time, we have capitalist assemblages that are undoing indigenous worlds, that are undoing indigenous land claims, that are undoing these long entangled relations of care that involve care for others, care for particular kinds of plants. One part of Sophie Chow's book describes how indigenous people in the south coast of West Papua are entangled with sago palms, how they depend on those life worlds for their own worlds. So we've got capitalist assemblages undoing that. At the same time, high finance capital is stepping in to try to solve this problem. You might approach this with optimism or pessimism, or you might say, maybe we need to just get rid of this system entirely. So Marx is the first to describe capital in a figurative register as a parasite that extracts vitality from us and also the environment, but it's also our host at this current moment. The scholar from Eastern Europe, Oksavnia Timofina, observes that if we try to kill capital, if we imagine slitting open the belly of the beast and imagining new forms of life and new economic systems emerging out of the wreckage, that might actually look like an attempted suicide. What is the self if it's not dependent on these various kinds of commodities that style the self, that style our hair, that give us nutrients? So how do we think about that kind of transformative justice that's needed without kind of totally undoing ourselves? This is where I get to kind of the decentered part of multi-species design. And here I'm thinking with Joe Dumet, who has this amazing dictum. He says, never think that you know all of the species involved in a decision. Never think that you speak for all of yourself. So in thinking about this first part, what we need to know is that when we make a decision as a consumer, as we become capitalist subjects and participate in these long distance relations of killing and extraction and dispossession, it's really difficult to know all of the species, but we might imagine, we might open up the commodity form and not think about the dancing table that Marx described, but all of the multi-species beings that are wiggling within the substance of these commodities. In the second part of the dictum, Joe Dumet says, never think that you speak all of yourself. What does he mean? In part, he's thinking with Lacan and others who've written about the divided subject, understanding subjectivity as something that's inherently split and decentered. Claire Bishop, the art critic, has also written very eloquently about the divided subject. She notes that there's a conflict between the concept of the subject as a decentered phenomena and the idea of political agency. The question becomes, can you have agency if you're decentered? If your desires are captured by all these marvelous products, can you be a fully autonomous subject? How do you assert autonomy while living with the desires of others? So if decentering implies a lack of a unified subject, agency, in contrast, implies the fully present autonomous subject that has political will and might have that possibility of self-determination. I'm going fast over these points. I'm trying to, the original version of this talk was an hour, and I'm condensing it into a half an hour. But if you want to go deep on this idea of the decentered subject, I invite you to read this article by Claire Bishop. It's one of my favorites to teach. It's called On Antagonism and Relational Aesthetics. She goes deep not only into Lacan, but thinking with Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau about decentered subjects and articulation theory. So that idea of agency that pops up here in relation to thinking about ourselves as subjects that are, inherently destabilized, I want to think not only in relation to Claire Bishop and Lacan and Donna Haraway, who I mentioned at the beginning, but also Bruno Latour. So his actor network theory is famous for bringing together the agents in networks. Non-human agency is his kind of central idea. I've, in my work, tried to push past Latour. I think the idea of non-human is a lot like non-white. It assumes that there's a lack of something. It establishes a standard against which others are compared. So this is why the multi-species idiom, I think, is more useful. So if we think about multi-species agency rather than non-human agency, assuming that others somehow lack something that the human has, I think we've got a better apparatus for moving forward and thinking about justice, but also thinking about design. So getting outside of that philosophy bubble that I just kind of briefly introduced you to, I want to introduce you to my favorite thinker about multi-species design. This is Milton Brennes. He's living in the highlands of Costa Rica, inherits both indigenous traditions of knowledge, but also importantly, colonial traditions of knowledge and scientific traditions of knowledge. He has a modest education, went through a local high school curriculum, but then basically developed this practical hands-on knowledge about how to do the work of multi-species worlding, although he uses different language to talk about it than I do. I think Milton is the figure of a bricoleur, someone who is very good at taking ideas from diverse sources and integrating them together in new ways. He's also a bricoleur, bringing together different life forms to build multi-species worlds. And what I'm going to tell you about is basically the last chapter of this book. And by the way, the background of our slides here is the highlands of Monteverde, which is a cloud forest that is studied with this informatics of domination, the same kind of information networks that Haraway describes in her Cyborg Manifesto. So basically what Milton did is took compacted soil that had been destroyed by cattle and capitalism and began slowly trying to work to bring it back into a convivial space, more like the cloud forest that is nearby in reserves. He was doing the work of multi-species design. His favorite plant, pictured here, Inga punctatum, produces food for quetzals, for monkeys, but also my favorite ant, Ectotoma ruidum, that I mentioned in the beginning. A keyword we might go deep on in the Q&A is interessement. I really think this is the keyword of multi-species design. Multi-species design that is decentered. This word comes not from Latour so much, but Michel Calon, who was writing about scallops and the ways to anchor them in shared worlds with people around the time that Latour is starting to come up with his apparatus. The basic point I want to make is, so interessement means the interpretation of the interests and needs of others and the enlistment of those others in a network or a world. So very often in actor network theory, the Latourian version, it's the humans that are doing the work of interessement, that are doing the work of enlisting others into a common world. But in this forest that Milton has recreated, it's the plant, Inga punctatum, that's enlisting others, that's creating future worlds. So in these worlds, I think it's important always to ask, design for whom, justice for whom, who benefits, cui bono. And this is where generative justice gets grounded. So one of the ways that Milton produced these forests was not with the help of a native animal, but an alien. This is the California redworm that was imported to Costa Rica. So this basically became a helper, a critter that helped bring these worlds into existence. You can read about these worms in many books. I highly recommend Mary Appelhoff's Worms Eat My Garbage. And what you see in this book is a cartoon of what interessement looks like. You see a worm bringing together a meeting, a multi-species assemblage involving all of these other different forms of life. And this is what happened basically from the ground up. So in 2008, we planted trees, transformative justice happened. Part of it was about enlisting particular kinds of life, Inga punctatum, but it was also a project that was open to surprises. And one of the surprises was this plant that's simply called monte in Costa Rica slang. This is another word for weed. And initially they started to try to control it or kill it, but they actually found that this plant was also a helper, just like the California redworm. This plant species helped regenerate the forest. So I went back just 8 years after those initial trees were planted. Milton didn't just plant Inga punctatum, his favorite plant, but he planted 12 species. When I went back with Eladio Cruz, who is also a Costa Rican intellectual, a parataxonomist who knows the trees and plants of the Costa Rican highlands better than almost anybody else in the world, we found that a living infrastructure had emerged with something like 38 different species of trees that weren't initially planted. So again, I want to come back to this idea from Joe Dumet: never think that you know all of the species involved in a decision or in a multi-species milieu. One of my favorite moments in doing a biodiversity survey with Milton was when he pulled a leaf off of a tree and invited me to look at a structure underneath called a domatia. He pointed out some mites that were living inside of this little hole within the tree leaf. So we had a species identification, Ocotoa tenera, but within it, we had other kinds of life that were barely perceptible, barely known. So that's the kind of wonder and opening to others that I think is so important in multi-species design. Um, just quickly to conclude, I want to point out that these kinds of concerns need not just play out on the periphery of the modern world system, but they can also play out in the core of some of our most industrialized cities. This is a picture of Sydney with all of the companies that shaped this part of town. We've got oil refineries, we've got a Union Carbide plant that manufactured Agent Orange that was used in Vietnam, as well as DDT, a number of other chemical industries. And as city planners tried to reckon with these toxic legacies, they had an opportunity that emerged with the Olympics. I've written about this in a piece called Chemosociality in Multi-Species Worlds, basically found that at least for one kind of life, this endangered frog pictured right here, they actually were flourishing in the toxic aftermath of industrialization. So sometimes design projects need to be very careful and not disturbing fragile ecological communities that have come into existence in the aftermath of industrialization. This is a picture of also not only the green and golden bell frog, but James Nguyen, a Vietnamese artist whose father was a refugee living alongside these chemical plants. James is doing some really interesting artwork about the ambivalent legacy of these toxic spaces in Sydney. I also, again, want to give a shout out to my partner, Asha Milevska, who is working with me now to take some of these abstract ideas about decentered multi-species design and put them into practice. She's a landscape architect that works for LDA Design, and together we've just put in for a fellowship that would actually embed some of these ideas in landscapes of the future. So the London Olympics in 2012 also resulted in this massive park that LDA and Asha and her colleagues built. Now we're at a point where we might reckon with the past legacies of exclusion and then imagine new possibilities of inclusion to think about who gets to live in the urban environments of London in the modern multi-species city. So thinking in conclusion with Kimberly Crenshaw, I ask, can intersectionality guide multi-species design? Can we hold on to multiple ideas of beauty, multiple ideas of justice as we imagine the architectures of the future, not just in the abstract realm of theory, not just in the aesthetic realm of art, but in terms of the living landscape that might be constructed either in cities or in rural areas. So with that, I thank you all and look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Eben. That was so insightful and interesting. And of course, I have a lot of questions that I look forward to hearing your responses on, but I'll keep it short, not too many questions for you. So in your talk, you spoke about interspecies encounters and entangled empathy. So my question is, can hope and empathy made possible through multi-species design be applied to decolonial practice?
Yeah, so absolutely. So hope is such an important and ambivalent idea. And in thinking about hope, you know, some of my most important teachers are the indigenous people of West Papua. So people who are living with genocide, living in a situation of unfreedom, where, you know, if you just kind of take inventory of the powers and, you know, not only the kind of abstract architecture of politics, but the actual on the ground destruction, it would be really easy to lose hope. So I hosted some Papuan leaders in Oxford last week, and one of them told me about a figure of hope that emerged in an unexpected place. One of the charismatic animals that you find in West Papua is the sulfur-crested cockatoo. It's a bird that lives to be 80 years old. It's got this very beautiful yellow kind of feather, kind of almost like punk hairdo on the top. And this came out of the forest that had just been clear cut and kind of landed and sort of fell over. And The people in the village assembled around it, tried to figure out how they might care for it. So it was a moment of profound sadness, but also in a moment of kind of recognizing failures. So the leaders who visited last week talked about how there were a delegation of women, and they were talking about how some of the men in the village had basically given away the land for nothing, like, you know, 100 pounds, and, you know, have our forest, which, you know, 100 pounds seems like a lot if you live in rural West Papua. So that was a moment of failing, but they were also trying to think about shared possible futures, not only with that particular bird that they might care for, but also from talking to other Papuan leaders, the idea of freedom, or merdeka, is an expansive hope for sovereignty, a moment of justice to come, that again might seem totally unrealistic. But if you think with you know, bring those ideas from indigenous thinkers into conversation with someone like Derrida or Walter Benjamin. Both of them describe messianic forms of hope that might suddenly grab a hold of a multitude, that might become infectious, that might go viral, to use a different idiom. You could see the ethical visions, the political visions of indigenous folks living on the periphery of the modern world system, living without the kinds of power that someone like me in a city like Oxford has. You might think about how those ethical visions gain traction in a world. So, you know, maybe one concrete way that, one concrete opportunity that we talked about last week is this new TFF thing. Billions of dollars are going to flow towards tropical forests. In West Papua, just doing some back of the envelope calculations, they're going to get approximately 1.8 billion a year just for leaving the forest standing. I think it's easy to be cynical about this. There was a launch event for the TFF program here in Oxford last week where the Brazilian delegation talked about how that money would be used largely in Brazil to fund the police. And in West Papua, you have long histories of the militarization of nature, the ways that the military and the police actually get in the way and are in bed with the logging companies and cynically profiting off of everything. But apparently within this new facility, at least 1/4 of the funds are supposed to go directly to indigenous people. So I think in thinking about the possibilities of hope amidst ongoing colonialism and genocide, I think it's kind of the small piecemeal victories, but also the openness to new opportunities that I find remarkable. Like even folks that, historically speaking, like if you just look at the past 50, 60 years, there's no empirical reason to hope, right? There's no reason to think if you're living in a village in West Papua that life should get better. But it's kind of the you know, the optimism of the intellect and the imagination, the pessimism of the will, that, or maybe I got that backwards from Gramsci, but there's kind of this dialectic that's going on, this interplay between what's realistic and unrealistic, and a play with what's imaginable that I find most inspirational from these sites like West Papua.
Very, very interesting response. And I'm now wanting to expand on your mention of embodied and indigenous knowledge and those living in conditions of unfreedom, as you said. And I was hoping to ask, what can we learn about multi-species relations from indigenous, mestizo, and other hybrid cultures, particularly across time in pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial epochs?
So maybe transitioning from Melanesia, from West Papua, and I should have kind of properly introduced it. West Papua is half of New Guinea. It's north of Australia. It's also the biggest tropical forest in Asia. It's massive, and it's the biggest tropical forest you've never heard of. But maybe going to Costa Rica, which was kind of the poster child of the Save the Rainforest campaign, I think one of the things that is easy to see in Costa Rica, and maybe less easy to see in a place like West Papua, is that these indigenous intellectuals like Milton Brennan, mestizo intellectuals who inherit these complicated histories of indigeneity alongside complicated histories of colonialism and science, are really in a position to do what Mary Louise Pratt calls transculturation. So they're drawing on these multiple resources and actually making innovations as they're bringing together different species. They're not just thinking about how to replicate a past in line with conventional conservation logics, but how to imagine a future that might be at the intersections of all these destructive processes. People like Milton are very savvy to the ways that, you know, cattle, capitalism, all these complicated forces have been destructive. But amidst the destruction, what kinds of figures of hope might be imaginable? But not only figures of hope, like what concrete practices might be enacted so that hopes might be grounded in a shared future. Part of what I didn't have chance to talk about in relation to Milton's project is how he's putting use values into these different kinds of trees. Some of the trees are trying to attract these charismatic megafauna, quetzal, toucan, monkeys. This attracts ecotourists with money, but probably more importantly, he's planting trees that have value as timber, that have value as one of the trees that he plants is called chancho, which is the Latin American word for pig. So these trees have nuts that the pigs like to eat. So they know they plant this tree, they can come back in future years and have a sustainable harvest of meat. So I think, you know, indigenous and mestizo intellectuals who are drawing on these diverse traditions, I think are doing some of the most innovative work. And at the same time, you know, high finance is promising to save the world with these new schemes. We need to look to people like Milton to kind of make sense of, you know, how to do the practical on the ground work that's actually creating and sustaining these worlds.
I feel like I wish we had more time because it's so complex and so insightful and extremely multi-layered. So I'll just ask my last question. And I actually want to quote from one of the books that you edited, The Multispecies Salon, that says that multi-species ethnographers began using art to explore biocultural borderlands, places where species meet. And I think that that is so important within the context of Viad Bada, Bioart and Design Africa. And I want to ask, what then is the role of the artist in cultivating awareness about multi-species ecologies?
Yeah, and I see Henrique Masao in the chat has a question that might tie in back to your question. Where can I learn more about this? So if you look at the Multispecies Salon book, you'll find some recipes in there that have been written in conversation with artists. So some of those are recipes for food that you can eat. There's a recipe for human cheese, which is something you totally can try at home that gets you to rethink your relations to food. But in relation to some of these reworlding practices, in there you've got a recipe from Deanna Pendell, someone who inherits white settler ancestry as well as indigenous ancestry from the Pacific Northwest. She plays with the figure of Dr. Seuss, the Lorax, I speak for the trees, to imagine the ways that we might reseed forests. So in the book, you'll find a recipe for this project she called Thneeds Reseeds, taking sweaters that nobody wants to create habitat for moss, which will help in her backyard regenerate Douglas firs and other trees that might go on to create old growth rainforest. In the same set of recipes, you'll also find one called Bitter Medicine is Stronger, led by Linda Noel, the poet laureate of one of the indigenous nations in California, as well as Kim Tallbearer, who's Lakota Sioux. And in this recipe, Bitter Medicine is Stronger, it talks about how to care for oak trees, but also how to prepare food that's falling around us in many landscapes in North America and elsewhere, how to take acorns off the ground, how to grind them, how to leach the tannins, the toxins out of them so that they're palatable, but you want to leave enough bitterness in there to remind the eater of the bitter legacies of colonialism. So I think maybe that those recipes in the book are one place to start to think about how bioart, eco art, and landscape art might take some of these ideas out of the abstract realm of theory and start to put them into practice.
Thank you. Definitely provided food for thought, pun intended, with your mention of recipes. So now we will be taking questions, but we'll only be taking 3 live questions from the audience. So please raise your hand if you have a question for Eben, and my colleague Jessica Malumbo will unmute your mic. Okay.
And I also see a number of questions in the chat. So if no one wants to raise their hand, I can also just engage with the questions in the chat.
Yeah, just please raise your hand as well. Just to answer a question in the chat from Neil, yes, I do believe that the recording will be shared. We have a question from Brenton Mart. Jessica, if you can please unmute, Brenton.
Sure. Hi. I've unmuted myself. Eben, thanks. That was so interesting. It raised so many interesting things. I mean, one of the key things that came to my mind was this sort of balance on the one hand between the sort of technological, the sort of forensic, the sort of modeling, the sort of machine learning, plotting of permutations and so forth, and working with those. On the one hand, and then also working with kind of a deep embodied indigenous knowledge, which also draws on those kinds of practices. So I have a question. I don't know if you have any kind of any insight into how to bridge these two worlds, whether machine learning is on the one hand being used for decentered multi-species design, and then how does that sort of dovetail with deep indigenous embodied knowledge?
Yeah, so I think these hybrid and monstrous assemblages that we've been able to describe ever since Haraway's Cyborg Manifesto are kind of a key thing that I'm trying to think with here. The Udaido Collective from West Papua, I think, is an example. I didn't show some of their works that more prominently feature technology, but if you can think of the last one that I showed as a figure of transformative justice, there's bullet casings there. There's kind of technologies of death, but coexisting with convivial forces of life. And I think you know, sometimes it's only possible to see the ways that these extractive assemblages and industries of pollution, like the ones that have made some parts of Sydney just like danger zones, you know, how it's only kind of destructive. But thinking with disabled scholars, thinking with you know, indigenous and Métis scholars from North America, like Max Liberon and Murphy, a scholar of science and technology studies, I think it's so important to get past any idea of indigenous purity that, you know, we might imagine the indigenous as something that's outside of the nation state or outside of technology. You know, once you pick up a smartphone, you're no longer indigenous. Like there was a news story that I was contacted for about 2 weeks ago asking me to say some thoughts about the so-called uncontacted tribes that have just been discovered. For starters, like any idea of indigeneity that isn't embedded in a long, rich history of migration, of dispossession, of opportunism, like this is a flat history that really fails to understand the complexity of lived indigenous experience. So yeah, I guess I find hope in these projects that are indigenous led, but also very savvy at engaging with both the latest technologies, but also political infrastructures and political architectures. Again, I think imagining the indigenous as the outsider is a problem. And I think it's so important to think about indigenous folks as creative agents that are making sense of the world on their own terms, and to really kind of follow their lead in the ways that different technologies, ideas, and processes are appropriated and re-articulated.
Okay, thank you, Eben, for your response to Brenton. I'm not seeing any other raised hands for a live question. So I'm going to shift onto the Q&A. I see two questions here for you. So we have an anonymous attendee who is asking, how do you navigate conflicts when the needs of humans and other species seem to clash?
Yeah, that's an important point. So I think in the multi-species project, there's a real emphasis placed on kind of intimacy, possibilities of improvisation and contact zones. This is what Donna Haraway describes in her 2008 book, When Species Meet. But I think it's equally important to recognize situations where interests are at odds with one another, either because an organism happens to get in the way of capitalism. This is kind of a common thing, whether that's a particular infrastructure or if they're just not being calculated for within logics of extraction. I'm going to point to one project of LDA Design. LDA is the company I mentioned at the end. It's a landscape architecture and design firm here in the UK. They've created some artificial nesting structures for a threatened bird here called I think it's the black-legged kittiwake. It's a species of kittiwake. And this is going along with a wind farm. So the largest offshore wind farm in the UK is off of the Suffolk coast. And as this project was getting off the ground, as predictions were made that this would effectively eliminate coal and other forms of polluting energy and effectively electrify millions of homes, there was concerns that the kittiwakes would be in decline as a result of this new 21st century infrastructure. So what LDA did was build a number of offshore nesting sites for the kittiwakes. And sometimes when you do a species-specific design project, they fail. And if I had had longer, I would have talked about the failings of some species-specific design work that was done in Sydney for the green and golden bellfrog. But in this particular case, the offshore structures, which are separating birds from people, are actually working. So what we might need on a much grander scale is some political decisions that invest in these kinds of architectures. They're not going to be profitable. The design work that's done for the kittiwake is not, helping anybody's bottom line. But if we can think and plan ahead, I think it's important to imagine both the possible coalescences where species and people might get along in new ways, but also the places where they diverge and new kinds of protective architectures need to be built. So that's part of what I'm hoping to do in this next stage. I've applied for a fellowship, and with any luck, I'll be working on this in the first half of next year.
Okay, that's great. And we have one last question from the Q&A from Hanali Kutsia, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, asking about any tips for urbanists. How can we bring biodiversity into cities under pressure when formal systems fail, like in Johannesburg? How can informal systems embrace growing, healthier urban features in these cracks?
Yeah, so I've got a PhD student right now, Alex Atkinson, who's working on guerrilla gardening in San Francisco. So, the guerrilla gardening movement, I think, is global at this point, and it's about looking for spaces of neglect, spaces of kind of top-down managerial simplicity and homogeneity, and looking for opportunities to enliven places, often in ways where you don't ask for permission or even for forgiveness, where you're making an intervention in space. So yeah, often these projects involve very complicated regimes of what you might call spatial warfare. There's often class, race, power dynamics embedded in these spaces. So I think we can find opportunities for intersectional justice projects. Sometimes those are kind of outside power, but it's also possible to work with city planners, to work with municipal authorities, to work with your neighbors, to try to figure out ways of enlivening a particular place. I also saw, if I might jump in, Adam Welts had a question too that I wanted to address and maybe try to drive home a point. So Adam says, sounds like you're reinventing reconciliation ecology as laid out in Michael Rosenweig's Win-Win Ecology in 2003. And I'm trying to do something actually quite different. And what I'm trying to work towards is better conflicts rather than win-win. So here I'm building on Isabel Stinger's Cosmopolitics, where she insists that we inhabit worlds where not everyone is going to share your values in human realms, right? We're not going to get to a world where Islam doesn't exist, where technoscience doesn't exist, where Christianity and Judaism aren't major forces that shape how people value the world and imagine the future. And at the same time, we're living in worlds with forms of life that don't always have our interests in mind. I'm finishing a book on viruses right now, trying to think about how a symbiotic bat virus became a coronavirus, became this pandemic that killed so many people worldwide. So it's not necessarily about finding a solution of kumbaya where we can all live together in harmony. I think symbiosis and symbiogenesis is about negotiating antagonisms, negotiating co-presences, even in worlds where we might wish the other doesn't exist. I think many people in the Zoom room probably had some deep wishes that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, did not exist, but nonetheless, we're kind of stuck with it. So how do we co-compose worlds with others that don't necessarily want to live with us, but we're stuck with? We're entangled in relations with predators and parasites that aren't always possible to escape. So asking the question, who benefits, cui bono, in these design projects is about bringing attention to the ways that the interests of some are often promoted over the interests of others. But how might we work with these others in assemblages that is more broadly inclusive, even in situations where sometimes critters or people in a particular place are entangled in struggles that seem to be violent and inevitably, this struggle to the death. The enemy is the other with whom there is the real possibility of struggle to the death. How do you turn those violent conflicts into better conflicts that might have good trouble in them, where if a problem does emerge, it might be resolved and addressed and responded to. So responsibility, the ability to respond in these worlds, means, in Haraway's words, sticking with the trouble, leaning into it, and thinking about symbiosis and symbiogenesis as a way of bringing harmony to situations of discord.
Amazing. I think that we have answered all the questions from the Q&A and there are no more live questions. So to close off, I just want to say from myself and on behalf of the VIA team, thank you so much, Professor Eben Kirksey, for your insightful contributions in your presentation, as well as your responses to the questions that I posed, as well as the participants here this evening. I think it has all posed many questions about a new emerging era of decolonial practice that is increasingly evolving through multi-species design, politics, and of course the more than human world. And I would also like to thank the participants for attending, for your thoughts, especially in the chat, and your questions. And please do keep an eye on our social media for more upcoming VIAD events. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed the conversation. And I see a question from Leora. So if you want to stay, we could have a one-on-one or a small group conversation if you want to stay after everyone else goes.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Totally,
Yes,
yeah. I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
Firstly, Eben, thank you for an absolutely brilliant, absolutely insightful and great talk, an extremely interesting project. Wow. For me, the question of coexistence or symbiotic existence with pathogenic entities, viruses being one of them, is an interesting one because we are so conditioned to thinking of viruses and bacteria as evil, harmful, and they usually refer to in terms of warfare, like, with COVID-19, it was like waging war on the enemy, and, destruction and destroying. But that is actually, I don't think, actually possible. So what are the alternatives?
Yeah, so the first third of my book is basically descriptive, trying to account for all the symbiotic viruses that make us who we are. So when Donna Haraway writes in 2008 about the symphony of kind of multi-species, more than human beings, that makes the conscious me possible, she's writing at a moment before we knew a key fact about viruses and how they make us think. So in the last 5 to 8 years, a guy named Jason Shepard described how this ancient retroviral infection basically co-composes every single memory we make, every long-term memory. So
Mm-hmm.
there's an explosion of viral particles from one neuron. They go into the neighboring nerve cell. They alter the connections of the synaptic gap, and this is how memories get made. Viruses also turn out to be integral to so many other biological functions. About half of the genome is viral. And those are just the endogenous viruses that we carry with us. Transient infections are coming and going all the time that really are poorly studied. So yeah, and thinking about the possibilities of symbiogenesis with pathogens, the book does a deep dive on the history of HIV and AIDS to think about symbiogenesis, not just as a biological process, but as something that started in the 80s to involve lawyers and mayors and journalists and activists who worked together to manufacture a new kind of biomedicine that enabled a stable, peaceful coexistence with this unwanted pathogen.
Excellent.
Yeah, so now
Yeah.
we're at this moment where, someone who's living with HIV is having a life expectancy very similar to normal. That is, if you're able to access the antiretrovirals. So part of my story is also one of innovation and inequality, and how, if you're living in New York City or London, you might have access to the latest antivirals, but in many parts of Africa or Southeast Asia, these medicines are unavailable, and they're unavailable for political and economic reasons rather than in any others. So yeah, I'm trying to think about how to not only live in symbiosis with viruses, but in symbiosis with capital in its various forms.
Yeah, there's also the idea that some viruses are actually beneficial to the body.
Totally.
I think they're called phages.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
and they
so
actually kill off harmful bacteria. Is that correct?
Exactly. Yeah. So I've got 3 chapters of my book that are about phages,
Oh,
and
wow.
strangely, we've known about phages and phage therapy longer than antibiotics. So this knowledge predates penicillin, and basically, phages have resisted capitalism, and that's why they're not more widespread. Although you get the persistence of phage therapy in some post-Soviet republics. Tbilisi, Georgia, is a really important center of innovation in
Yes, that's
therapy.
right.
So you hear a lot about multi-drug resistant bacteria these days. In fact, more people are dying of multi-drug resistant bacteria than people were dying of COVID during the height of the pandemic. Yet somehow we haven't figured out how to expand phage therapy and make it available to all the millions of people that need it every year. So part of the book is kind of an unraveling of this story of market failure, but also yeah, phage are wonderful. I mean, in addition to like coursing through the human body and protecting us from bacteria, phage are also mediating the global carbon cycle. So in the milieu of plankton, phages are augmenting photosynthetic abilities, augmenting phosphorus foraging abilities, but also sometimes killing microorganisms and causing this sequestration of carbon in the ocean seafloor as the dead organisms rain to the bottom. So the book opens with a story, this long story about phage and how little we know about the virus sphere, and how small our knowledge is compared to this global informatics. If we think about viruses as fluxes of matter and meaning that are propagating in their host organisms, you might start thinking not about Gaia as this unified whole, but this decentered, like so complex process that's unfolding as we speak, that's utterly beyond the human mind to grasp. So I start the book from that space of wonder, and then kind of lead readers to some of the pathogens, and then try to explain how to live with these pathogens.
Well, I cannot wait to read the book.
Thank you. I'm hopefully sending it back to my editor in the next couple of days. So with any
Sweet.
luck, it'll be out next year.
The sooner it comes out, the better. Thank you.
Thank you for introducing me to everyone, Leora, and this has been a remarkable event. And Keisha, thank you so much for hosting, and I've really enjoyed this conversation.